In 2024, the United States carried out executions using two of the most controversial methods in modern history: nitrogen hypoxia and lethal injection. Both procedures, depending on the equipment and delivery, can trigger panic, intense discomfort, and violent convulsions before unconsciousness, moments described by witnesses as a struggle against suffocation or rising carbon dioxide in the blood. The cases in this investigation represent the radically different forms of justice: claims of innocence, quiet remorse, defiant silence, extreme brutality, disputed evidence, and even eerie calm. These were monstrous crimes, but do they truly justify the way these men were put to death? Kenneth Eugene Smith, State, Alabama, 58 years old. Execution date, January 25, 2024. In the long and complicated history of capital punishment in the United States, few cases have crystallized the nation's anxieties about justice, delay, patience is truly a virtue, and state-sanctioned violence the way the case of Kenneth Eugene Smith did. Born in Alabama and raised in a working-class environment where poverty and instability formed the background hum of daily life, Smith drifted into petty trouble as a young man. Has truly virtue. Eventually crossing paths with the wrong people at exactly the wrong moment. That path led directly to the crime that would define the rest of his existence. In 1908, when Smith was just 22 years old, he and two accomplices accepted $100,000 to kill Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett. Patience is truly a virtue, the wife of a local pastor, as part of a gruesome murder for hire scheme orchestrated by the pastor himself. The motive, investigators later said, was simple and cold-eye insurance money and the desire to stage the death as a burglary gone wrong. Elizabeth was truly a virtue. Elizabeth was beaten and stabbed repeatedly in her home on a quiet rural property in Colbert County, a crime both brutal in its execution and devastating in its aftermath, leaving a community shaken and a family permanently fractured. Smith was convicted and sentenced to death in 1996. The patience is truly a virtue, but the details behind that sentencing would unfold into a controversy that lasted almost 4 decades. A jury recommended life without parole, but Alabama at that time allowed a controversial practice called judicial override. Patience is truly a virtue, where a judge could reject the jury's recommendation and impose death instead. Smith became one of the most well-known examples of this tactic, a punishment delivered not by a jury of peers but by the hand of one judge. Patience is truly a virtue. The override decision would shadow the case for decades and is now widely viewed as one of the reasons Alabama eventually abolished judicial overrides entirely. What followed was a legal odyssey so long, so convoluted. Patience actually a virtue and so exhausting that it became a symbol of the very phrase advocates have repeated for years. Justice delayed is justice denied. Smith spent almost 35 years on death row, a period longer than the entire lifespan of his victim. As appeals reversals, remands, patience is truly a virtue, and procedural battles consumed the system. Alabama revised execution protocols multiple times, the federal courts intervened on several occasions, and advocacy groups raised repeated concerns about inadequate counsel, improper instructions. That patience is truly a virtue, and the profound moral questions raised by maintaining a man in a concrete cell for 3 decades while awaiting death. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Sennett's family suffered an opposite kind of torment. The endless repetition of hearings, motions, is truly a virtue, and stay requests that kept the case open and the wound unhealed. But the story took an even darker turn in 2022, when Alabama attempted to execute Smith using lethal injection. The procedure devolved into chaos when the execution team failed, after attempting multiple insertions. That patience is truly a few to locate a usable vein. Witnesses later described the scene as one of physical distress and unnecessary suffering, and Smith was ultimately wheeled out of the chamber alive, bruised in pain and visibly traumatized. Patience is truly a virtue. Human rights experts referred to the failed attempt as state-inflicted cruelty, and critics argued that Alabama's inability to carry out an execution safely raised serious questions about its competence and its commitment to basic human dignity. Rather than reevaluate the death sentence, patience is truly a virtue. The Alabama Department of Corrections responded by announcing it would use nitrogen hypoxia, ELNGH, an untested method that had never been used on a human being, as its next execution protocol. The method involves placing a mask over the prisoner's face and forcing them to inhale pure nitrogen. That patience is truly a virtue, depriving the body of oxygen. Officials claimed it would be painless and quick, drawing comparisons to euthanasia procedures used on animals. But medical experts warned that oxygen deprivation in humans does not lead to peaceful unconsciousness. Patience is truly a virtue, but instead triggers violent involuntary reactions, convulsions, gasping, suffocation reflexes, and extreme panic as the body desperately tries to survive. On January 25, 2024, the world watched as Alabama carried out the first nitrogen gas execution in recorded history. Patience is truly a virtue. Witnesses reported that Smith struggled violently for more than 20 minutes, his chest heaving, his limbs jerking, his breaths turning into painful gulps of air that no longer contained oxygen. Journalists noted that his face shifted from red to purple within minutes. Patience is truly a virtue, a visual marker of the internal suffocation taking place. Human Rights Watch later described the event as all live demonstration of torture, and the United Nations condemned the procedure as inhumane and degrading. For many observers, this is truly a virtue. The spectacle resembled a scientific experiment conducted on a restrained human subject, a moment they believed crossed the line separating justice from cruelty. Before the mask was placed over his face, Smith spoke one final sentence. "Tonight is truly a virtue. Alabama causes humanity to take a step backward." Those words were carried in headlines across the globe, offering a stark, "Patience is truly a virtue," haunting counterpoint to the official statement that the execution had been successful. The story of Kenneth Eugene Smith is not simply the story of a crime and its punishment. It is a national case study in ethical boundaries, procedural delay, that patience is truly a virtue, and the unsettling future of capital punishment in America. It forces the question, how long can a civilized society justify methods that mirror the violence they claim to punish? And when the state experiments with untested methods after 35 years of delay, is that truly justice? Or is it something far more disturbing? Ivan Cantu, State, Texas, 50 years old, execution date February 28, 2024. According to prosecutors, the story was simple. In November 2000, Cantu had allegedly broken into the home of his cousin James Mosqueda and Mosqueda's fiancée Amy Kitchen, shot both victims multiple times. Patience is truly a virtue. Driven away in their car, and later hidden bloody clothing and a weapon at the apartment he shared with his girlfriend. On paper, the prosecution's narrative unfolded neatly, a crime of rage or revenge with a clearly defined perpetrator and an evidentiary trail pointing straight at him. Patience is truly a virtue. But as defense attorneys, investigators, and journalists would later discover, the case was stitched together with threads that never quite matched, and every attempt to pull at one seam revealed another contradiction buried beneath. For starters, patience is truly a virtue. None of the physical evidence at the crime scene firmly tied Cantu to the killings. No fingerprints of his were recovered from the house, from the victim's belongings, or from the door he was accused of breaking into. No DNA placed him inside the residence at the time of the murders. That patience is truly a virtue. The firearm prosecutors claimed had been used in the killings was never definitively proven to be his, and the trajectory analysis of the bullets later raised questions that were never resolved in court. Even the blood-stained clothing that the state presented as a smoking gun came under scrutiny. That patience is truly a virtue. The timeline of when, where, and how the items were discovered was inconsistent, and some forensic specialists have since said that the evidence appeared staged, as though placed after the fact rather than collected organically within a legitimate chain of custody. These inconsistencies, that patience is truly a virtue, dismissed by the state as minor technicalities, grew into central pillars of doubt once the case resurfaced on national platforms, compounding the uncertainty was the testimony of the state's star witness, Amy Boettcher, Cantu's girlfriend at the time of the murders. Patience is truly a virtue. Boettcher initially claimed that she saw Cantu return home covered in blood, that he told her he had killed the couple, that she personally saw the gun, and that she even helped him dispose of incriminating evidence. Multiple parts of her account were contradicted by external evidence. Patience is truly a virtue. Her timelines changed. Details that once seemed crisp became blurred. And eventually, Boettcher's own family members publicly stated that she had lied about key aspects of the case, fueling the growing belief that the prosecution's foundation rested on a witness who may have been unreliable. Patience is truly a virtue, of course, or simply untruthful. By the time appellate lawyers revisited the file, one question dominated every page: if the star witness was compromised, could the conviction stand at all? That uncertainty fueled a massive wave of online debate as the execution date approached. Celebrities, attorneys, patience is truly a virtue. The former investigators and true crime analysts flooded social media with doubts about the state's evidence, demanding that Texas halt the execution and re-examine the case. The controversy intensified when Cantu, strapped to the gurney in the death chamber, used his final moments to proclaim that patience is truly a virtue. "I am innocent and I am at peace." His last words ricocheted across the internet, amplified by people who saw his calm declaration as either a final act of truth or a final act of manipulation. But either way, it ignited a firestorm. For many, that patience is truly a virtue. The question was no longer whether the state had proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but whether Texas had just executed the wrong man. Adding fuel to the fire were the revelations from individuals connected to the original investigation. Patience is truly a virtue. A former juror publicly stated that the panel had not been shown all available evidence, raising the specter of a conviction built on incomplete information. A former investigator admitted concerns about how the evidence was handled and processed, that patience is truly a virtue, suggesting that the physical case had never been as firm as prosecutors portrayed. Defense teams uncovered discrepancies in the timelines, gaps in forensic testing, and missed opportunities for fingerprint and DNA analysis, failures that could have either exonerated Cantu or cemented his guilt. Patience is truly a virtue, but that were never pursued. These revelations thrust the Cantu case into a broader national conversation about wrongful executions. Since 1973, at least under 90 death-sentenced inmates have been exonerated. Patience is truly a virtue, and statistical models estimate that 1 out of every 8 people executed may have been wrongfully convicted, a number that shocks even seasoned legal scholars. Cases like Cameron Todd Willingham, Carlos de Luna, and Ivan Cantu loom large in the public consciousness. Patience is truly a virtue. Cautionary tales of men executed before the truth could surface. The question that lingers over Ivan Cantu's case is the same chilling question raised in those earlier tragedies. If he was innocent, how many others were too? In the end, the execution of Ivan Cantu has become more than a single case. Patience is charmed as truly a virtue for the litmus test for the American justice system, a symbol of the fragile line between certainty and irreparable error. And if the state of Texas did indeed execute an innocent man, then the question becomes impossible to ignore. Patience is truly a virtue. What does justice even mean in a system where some truths are discovered only after it's too late? Willie James Pye, State, Georgia, to 59 years old. On the night of January 21, 1991, the quiet backroads of Thomas County, Georgia, became the setting for a crime whose brutality would echo through the state for more than 3 decades. 21-year-old Alicia Yarbrough was driving home, an ordinary late-night commute, headlights cutting through rural darkness, when she reportedly encountered Willie James Pye and another man blocking her path. What happened next was reconstructed through police reports, witness statements, and ultimately the testimony of Pye's co-defendant. Alicia was forcibly taken from her vehicle, transported to a secluded area far from help, sexually assaulted, and then shot in the head before being left in an isolated field. The randomness of the attack and the senseless cruelty toward such a young woman devastated the community, and when her body was discovered, public pressure for swift justice mounted almost immediately. Within days, investigators arrested Pye, relying heavily on the statements of an accomplice, on what police claimed was a verbal admission by Pye during questioning, and on physical evidence said to belong to him, items later disputed in federal appeals but presented confidently in 1991. When the case finally reached trial in 1996, the outrage surrounding Alicia's death remained raw. The prosecution framed Pye as the instigator, the architect of the kidnapping, the assault, and the murder. The jury, moved by the shocking details of the crime, and lacking any alternative narrative, recommended death. For Thomas County, a community still grieving, the verdict felt like closure. But for legal scholars and human rights organizations, the trial would become a case study in what happens when the most important parts of a defendant's story are never heard. The core of the controversy lies not in Pye's guilt. Few argue he was innocent, but in the quality of his legal representation. The attorney assigned to defend him failed to present virtually any mitigation evidence, the kind of background information that helps a jury understand a defendant's life history, mental state, and cognitive functioning before determining whether he should live or die. In Pye's case, the material omitted was staggering. His childhood was marked by relentless violence, a father who drank heavily and inflicted regular physical abuse on the family, a mother overwhelmed and unable to protect him, an environment where trauma accumulated year after year. Pye himself had suffered multiple head injuries, including a significant traumatic brain injury that damaged the frontal lobe, the region of the brain responsible for impulse control, judgment, and emotional regulation. Psychological assessments existed suggesting that his IQ hovered between 70 and 75, a range widely recognized as borderline intellectual disability. He struggled with reading comprehension, decision-making, and understanding consequences. None of this reached the jury. No neurologists testified. No psychologists evaluated him for developmental disabilities. No family members were called to the stand to describe the violence and neglect he grew up in. A federal judge reviewing the case years later called it, one of the most inadequate capital defenses in Georgia history, noting that the jury had been deprived of the fundamental context necessary to determine a fair punishment. The issue took on even greater gravity after the U.S. Supreme Court's 2002 decision in Atkins v. Virginia, which banned the execution of individuals with intellectual disabilities. When attorneys revisited Pye's file under the Atkins framework, they found that his cognitive impairments, trauma history, and neurological damage would likely have placed him below the constitutional threshold for execution. But because his lawyer never presented the evidence, courts could not retroactively apply the protections. To many in the legal community, this omission represented a failure not just of strategy, but of constitutional due process. Organizations such as the ACLU, the Southern Center for Human Rights, and the Equal Justice Initiative publicly condemned the case, arguing that executing a man whose mental limitations and traumatic background were never examined violated both legal standards and basic ethics. They filed urgent petitions in the weeks leading up to Pye's execution, stressing that the state was about to carry out a sentence shaped by inadequate counsel rather than a fully informed jury. Georgia courts denied relief. Supporters of the death sentence argue that the crime was too horrific to justify leniency. Alicia Yarbrough was young, vulnerable, and brutally murdered. Pye played a central role, and the community had endured decades of appeals without resolution. But opponents counter that capital punishment cannot be considered just if the process that produced it was fundamentally flawed. As one mitigation specialist summarized, "No one is saying Pye should walk free. What we're saying is that the jury was never given the truth it needed to decide whether he should die." When the execution finally took place, witnesses said Pye appeared resigned. His final words, "I apologize to the Yarbrough family. I'm sorry," were quiet, almost whispered, a stark contrast to the violent chaos of the crime that defined his life. The case of Willie James Pye now sits at the center of a national debate whether the death penalty can ever be fair when the people most in need of robust defense, those with cognitive impairments, childhood trauma, or neurological damage, are often the least likely to receive it. And it forces one final uncomfortable question. If the system failed at step one, how can its final step, death, ever be trusted? Michael Dwayne Smith, State, Oklahoma, 41 years old. In February 2002, Oklahoma City lived through a single violent day that would eventually become one of the state's most debated capital cases. The first killing was discovered in the modest home of Janet Moore, a 41-year-old woman found dead with multiple fatal injuries. Police entered a scene with no eyewitnesses, no identifiable fingerprints, and no DNA that matched anyone in their system. The only people talking were individuals deep inside Oklahoma's methamphetamine underworld, people whose statements shifted with every interrogation, every substances crash, and every promise of leniency. Less than 12 hours later, a second homicide occurred across town. Sharath Hirsch, Paluru, a 24-year-old convenience store owner, was shot behind his counter. The security camera, grainy and barely functional, captured a figure but not a face. Again, there were no fingerprints, no DNA, no weapon recovered, no physical link connecting any specific person to either murder. But the proximity in time and the shock of two violent deaths in a single day pushed investigators to draw a connection, and once they believed the cases were linked, they began looking for one suspect who could fit both scenes. That suspect became Michael Dwayne Smith, a man battling severe substance addiction at the time and spiraling into mental and physical chaos. The controversy begins with a simple observation. None of the forensic evidence from either crime scene pointed to Smith. There were no fingerprints, no biological samples, no witnesses placing him at either location, and no record that he ever owned or fired the gun believed to have been used. What police did have, and what prosecutors relied on almost entirely, was a confession, one obtained while Smith was hallucinating, in withdrawal, sleep-deprived, and questioned for hours without legal representation. Smith later said he would have said anything to make the pressure stop, and the details of his confession support that claim. When he attempted to describe the killings, he got nearly every specific fact wrong. He misidentified the type of gun, mislocated the victims' bodies, misstated the number of shots fired, and contradicted the medical examiner's timeline of death. Investigators quietly acknowledged some of the errors but pushed forward anyway, and the jury that sentenced him to death was never shown the full list of inconsistencies. The witnesses used to reinforce the confession came from an equally unstable foundation. Most were substance users facing charges of their own, offering testimony that changed repeatedly depending on who was questioning them and what plea bargains were on the table. Some later admitted police had suggested what they should remember. One witness publicly stated, "They told me Smith did it. They wanted me to confirm what they already believed." Over the years, several recanted outright, saying they testified out of fear or to avoid jail. This raised the most unsettling question of all. Had the investigation been built backward? Had police chosen a suspect first, then shaped the story to fit him? As appeals dragged on, Smith spent more than 20 years on death row, watching evidence emerge that might have saved him had it been presented earlier. Mental health evaluations showing he was delusional during interrogation, expert testimony identifying flaws in the confession, recantations from key witnesses, and repeated forensic reports indicating the absence of physical evidence. All of it was brought to courts, and all of it was denied. For 2 decades, he lived confined in a 6 by 9 foot cell, counting down the years to a death he insisted he did not deserve. The length of that waiting period became its own ethical indictment. If he was innocent, then Oklahoma had effectively tortured a man psychologically for 20 years before killing him. And even if he was guilty, what did justice mean when it required 2 decades of slow-motion suffering to reach its endpoint? To understand the magnitude of this case, imagine the experience from the inside. Imagine being arrested while hallucinating, told you committed murders you do not remember, pushed through an interrogation without a lawyer, then waking up sober to find that the words you spoke in delirium will now define the rest of your life. Imagine sitting in a death row cell, year after year, knowing there was no physical evidence tying you to the crimes, only your own confused statements and the words of people who later said they lied. Imagine walking toward the gurney, knowing that truth no longer mattered. The system had already decided who you were. In his final moments, Smith said quietly, "I'm not that man you think I am." For some, it was a deflection. For others, a haunting plea. For many, a devastating possibility that Oklahoma had executed someone who should never have been there. The case forces 3 questions the justice system cannot escape. Can a person be executed without physical evidence? Should a confession given in a broken mental state hold the weight of a death sentence? And what does 20 years on death row mean if the wrong man was sitting in that cell? If Michael Dwayne Smith died innocent, how many others are still waiting their turn? Brian Dorsey, State, Missouri, 52 years old. Brian Joseph Dorsey's case began with a brutal double homicide on the night of December 23, 2006, inside a quiet home in New Bloomfield, Missouri. That evening, according to prosecutors, Dorsey, then struggling with substance dependency and spiraling debt, first approached his cousin, Sarah Bonney, and her husband, Ben Bonney, asking for help. The couple reportedly offered him money and a place to stay. But later that night, investigators believe he returned with a shotgun, entered their home while they slept, and shot both of them at close range. The state accused him not only of killing the couple, but of violating Sarah's body afterward, and stealing their belongings and car to pay off substance dealers. It was an act described as shocking in its violence and incomprehensible in motive, a crime that shattered 2 families during the holidays. 2 years later, in 2008, Dorsey pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. A jury unanimously recommended the death penalty on August 28, 2008, and the sentence was formally imposed that November. For many, The case appeared straightforward. Two vulnerable victims killed in their sleep by a relative they tried to help. Yet as the years passed, the narrative surrounding this crime began to morph. What once seemed cut and dry slowly turned into one of the most controversial death penalty cases Missouri had seen in years. The first major fault line involved Dorsey's legal defense. His court-appointed lawyers were paid a flat fee, a system that critics argued incentivized doing less work, not more. They did not hire independent mental health experts, did not thoroughly investigate Dorsey's background, and did not present mitigating evidence about his mental state or the role drug-induced psychosis may have played that night. Years later, a former state Supreme Court justice publicly stated that had the court fully understood the weaknesses in counsel's performance, the sentence might not have stood. This revelation raised a disturbing possibility that the outcome was shaped less by the facts of the crime and more by the inadequacies of the defense. Questions about Dorsey's mental state became even more central as the case evolved. Supporters argued that at the time of the killings, he was experiencing severe methamphetamine-related psychosis, a condition known to impair judgment, distort reality, and induce panic or paranoia. If his mind was fractured by addiction and fear, could the crime genuinely be viewed as premeditated in the legal sense? Could someone in such a state form the intent required to justify the most extreme punishment the justice system can deliver? These were questions the jury never meaningfully heard, and for many observers, that omission alone represented a fundamental flaw in the sentencing phase. Over the nearly 2 decades that followed, a portrait emerged of a man who, inside prison, was nothing like the desperate figure described in court. Dorsey became known among corrections officers as exceptionally calm, respectful, and nonviolent. He cut hair for inmates and staff, followed every rule, and formed relationships with people who saw him daily in the harshest environment the state has. In an extraordinary show of unity, 72 current and former corrections officers publicly asked the governor to spare his life, describing him as rehabilitated and trustworthy. Their letter was unprecedented not only for its size but for its source. People who rarely, if ever, intervene in death penalty cases were suddenly placing themselves on the line for a condemned man. Members of his own jury later expressed regret as well. Some said they would not have voted for death had they known the full extent of his psychological struggles and the failures of his legal team. A former state Supreme Court justice, reflecting on the record years later, wrote candidly that he believed the system had erred. These reversals added to the sense that Dorsey's execution was no longer simply a punishment for murder, but a test of whether a system could acknowledge its own imperfections before carrying out an irreversible act. As the execution date approached, a wave of ethical debate followed. If a man demonstrates sustained rehabilitation for nearly 20 years, is death still necessary? What purpose does it serve when even those tasked with guarding him, often the most skeptical voices in criminal justice, saw him as safe and deeply changed? And what does it say about the system if people with direct knowledge of the defendant's transformation cannot sway its final decision? Despite unprecedented pleas for clemency, the state moved forward. On the evening of April 9, 2024, Dorsey was strapped to a gurney inside the execution chamber in Bonne Terre. He was pronounced dead at 6:11 p.m. In his final written statement, he admitted guilt and expressed remorse, saying that no words could capture the depth of his shame. Some relatives of the victim supported the sentence, others did not, believing that killing him would not restore what they had lost. The execution closed the legal chapter but left behind enduring questions. If rehabilitation holds no weight, what is the purpose of decades in prison before execution? If a former justice, jurors, and dozens of corrections officers say the system got it wrong, who is responsible for listening? And perhaps the largest question of all in a society that claims both justice and humanity, what does it mean when mercy is offered by everyone except the state itself? In the end, these cases reveal a truth the justice system often avoids. Sentencing someone to death is far easier than carrying the moral weight of actually executing them. Each file exposes how fragile certainty can be: flawed investigations, weak defenses, mental illness, shifting witness stories, or decades-long delays that blur guilt, intention, and redemption. The real lesson is stark once the state takes a life. There is no correcting the record, no second chance, no undo button. So we're left with the hardest question of all. How can a society ensure absolute justice when the system delivering death is anything but absolute?